The Constitution's full faith and credit clause requires courts to recognize judgments issued in other states. But if a second court concludes that the first lacked jurisdiction and then renders a judgment that conflicts with the first court, a third court may be called upon to decide which judgment controls. In Treinies v. Sunshine Mining Company, the United States Supreme Court addressed how the third court should resolve such a conflict. Amelia Pelkes owned shares in Sunshine Mining Company. When Amelia died, her will divided the shares between her husband, John Pelkes, and her daughter from another marriage, Katherine Mason. Ultimately, however, John obtained possession of all the shares. He believed he owned them, thinking Katherine gave her interest to him. But Katherine believed that John was holding half the shares in trust for her. When John assigned the shares to Evelyn Treinies, Katherine filed suit in the District Court of Idaho against John, Treinies, and Sunshine, claiming that she was the rightful owner of half the shares. While that suit was pending, Katherine also petitioned the Superior Court of Washington, where probate of Amelia's will was pending, to remove John as executor. John counterclaimed, asserting ownership of the shares. Katherine sought a writ of prohibition in the Washington Supreme Court to prevent the Superior Court from deciding ownership, arguing that the court lacked jurisdiction. The Supreme Court denied the writ, and the Superior Court ultimately concluded that John owned the shares. The District Court of Idaho concluded, however, that the Washington court lacked jurisdiction to decide ownership. It then entered its own judgment, holding that Katherine owned half the shares. John and Treinies subsequently filed suit in the Superior Court of Washington, asking the court to quiet title in their favor and order Sunshine to recognize their ownership. At that point, Sunshine filed an interpleader action in federal court. It surrendered the shares to the court and named John, Treinies, and Katherine as parties and asked the court to resolve the inconsistent state court judgments without Sunshine's involvement. The district court upheld the Idaho judgment in Katherine's favor. The Ninth Circuit affirmed, holding that the Idaho judgment was res judicata in the federal action because this was essentially the same ownership dispute between the same parties. The United States Supreme Court granted cert.